Hi, everybody. It's the Wednesday after the fourth Sunday after the Epiphany, and it's time for another Wednesday Word. I also want to note that today, the first Wednesday in February, is also the first Wednesday in what has come to be celebrated as African American or African Descent or Black History Month. And I want to talk a little bit about that today, because you'll sometimes hear during months like this, like Black History Month, that it's harmful, or at least not helpful, for us to parcel out these different months to talk about the history and the contributions of certain groups. I think in a way, some of those criticisms are valid, but I don't think that they're necessarily valid in the way that people who bring them up often think that they are. The problem with having a month like Black History Month is not that it's unnecessarily or unduly lifting up the contributions of groups that have previously not been lifted up to the exclusion of others. I think that is all well and good, and in fact, I think it's a real gift if we take the time to invest in it. The problem is when we don't study that history, when we don't hear those stories, when we don't value those contributions in the entire rest of the year. Because what that does is subtly reinforce the idea that history, without any modifiers, is a neutral concept. I want to give you another area of study as an example of this. I've talked about this in some of the Bible studies that I've done here at church. This is a very important and famous and well-known among biblical scholars book of feminist theology by the scholar Dr. Elizabeth N. Johnson. This is a great introduction to womanist biblical interpretation by Dr. Nyasha Jr. Womanism is sort of a combination of feminism and African American studies, and it takes into account the idea that Black women in particular deal with multiple levels of challenge in the broader society, and so there are particular ways of approaching the world and recognizing those challenges that are unique to both feminism and Black theology. So we have a book of womanist biblical interpretation. This book by Dr. James Cone is rooted in the Black liberation theology tradition. It's also really powerful. This book by Richard Twiss presents a Native American expression of the Jesus way. It's theology grounded in the Native American experience. And then this book is a book of theology from all kinds of different perspectives: feminist, womanist, mujerista, liberation, Minjung, Korean theology. And this is widely considered to be a book of theology. It was written by a man of American European descent. He teaches at our seminary in Berkeley, California, and it would be very common if you ran into that book as an introductory textbook in a seminary classroom, for example, for it to be considered a systematic theology introduction or a book about theology writ large. That idea, that understanding that this can be called a book of theology, and these other books need all these descriptors for us to know what they're about, is a problem. And again, it's not because these books have particular perspectives that we should pay attention to, because I think we should. The problem is that a book like this, in some ways, hides the perspective from which it's written. It purports to be a book about theology in general, a book that describes the world without the need for any of the modifiers that are in these other ones. But theology like that simply takes the worldview of someone who looks like me and makes it universal. We can do the same thing with history, with biblical interpretation, with all kinds of other things. And the result of doing that is both that we as people who look this way don't recognize how our way of looking at the world is pushed out and imposed on other people, and we don't get a chance to recognize how our particular setting in the world colors the way that we think about history and theology and biblical interpretation. So what's the solution? Again, it's not to get rid of Black History Month, because Black History Month and reading books like this and this and this are essential parts of getting to think more broadly about the experience of God, about theology, about the story that we tell ourselves about who we are. The solution is to dive deep into these perspectives, to take seriously the idea that they have things to teach us about the real world, that they have ways of communicating to us something about God, something about the experience of people across the world, and that knowing about that experience is valuable because it helps us to see what other people know and experience every day. And it can help us to know God in a way that we might not even think of trying to imagine God in. So I'm aware that concepts like Black History Month sometimes are looked at sort of sideways, that they seem like something that undermines unity. The reality is that they don't, if we approach them rightly, if we see them as opportunities to look through a different perspective than our own, to recognize that our perspective is particular rather than universal, and to see them as opportunities to be curious about our neighbors, about our friends, and about the God who has made all of us in God's image, the God who loves all of us, the God who lives in and among us and our communities in particular ways. I encourage you during this month, if you have an opportunity, to do some study of Black history, to lean into those different perspectives on the story of our country. Sometimes it will be uncomfortable. Sometimes you'll hear events talked about in a way that you don't recognize. But that's okay, because understanding those stories, hearing those different perspectives can broaden our horizons. It can help us to see more of the whole story of where we've come from and where we can go together if we do so hand in hand. I hope you're all safe and well. I'll look forward to seeing you next week for another Wednesday Word. Peace and good to you all. Bye-bye.